We're here with Ehav Ever from Eretz Yisrael. Can you tell us a little bit about your story?
Okay. I've been, of course, as you mentioned, my name is Ehav Ever, and I've been living in Israel for about 10 years now. Made Aliyah from New York around 2007. Yes, I guess it's almost 11 years. I work here in Israel in the high-tech field, and I'm the author of a sci-fi novel known as Masot, The Journey Beyond, as well as a book about a fighting system named Masoret of Abir Keshet, which was Shita from, or a group of techniques from a family that was from Haban in Yemen. I've also written a couple of articles for the Institute of Jewish Ideals and Ideas, and a number of Wikipedia articles concerning Jewish history from migrations into West Africa, the Samaritans, Ethiopian Jews, Yemenite Jews, and a number of articles that are on Facebook. I've kind of done what I call in Hebrew sivuv bin lomi, which is like going around different parts of the world. I used to live in New York, California, Texas, Missouri, New Jersey, as well as I was in Japan twice, here in Israel twice before I made Aliyah, in Ethiopia once. In terms of, I guess you could say, like in terms of Torah, things like that. When I was in New York, I used to learn from a number of rabbis, because I always believed that, to learn from different sources, different people from different communities, not just particularly one. And I learned from Rabbi Yaish from the Temini Bet Knesset in Manhattan, Rabbi Mark Angel from the Spanish Portuguese, and Rabbi Iswot Golunter from the Midtown Manhattan Bet Knesset. And here in Israel, from Mori Yad Ben Shalom, Mori Yoshe Ben Tuftoch, Rabbi Gabriel Sheikh, and Mori Shlomo Ben Haim from the Bet Knesset Rambam here in Yerushalayim. And more or less, that's the short version, I guess, of the story. I guess anything else in terms of who I am is kind of, I guess, in terms of what I hold by Torah Moshe. One of the ways, I guess, to express that is one of the rabbis I used to learn from used to say, it's like living with the truth with a capital T. Basically, the Masorah, basically being anything that's ancient, authentic, and authoritative, being the guiding lines for anything that I do, for example. That's the way I was taught, for example, in terms of how to manage a lifestyle in Torah, and also to manage interactions Torah and understanding Torah. So,
What type of Judaism would you say you practice?
Well, that's kind of a difficult situation here in Israel, because, as far as Israel is concerned, at least in the communities I'm involved in, there is no, most people don't go around saying Judaism and what type of Judaism do you practice. It's like, for example, if you look in, I think, the writings of both the Rambam and Rabbi Sadi Gaon, the main thing they talk about is the truth. They never use the word, for example, Judaism, per se, because, of course, it's more of a anglicized, I guess, kind of word. So, if anything, I would just say I hold by Torah Moshe. And again, if anything can be proven to be ancient, authentic, and authoritative, from a Masorah, then that's, what I hold by. So it's kind of, I think, what the Rambam mentions in one place where, we hold by the truth no matter which way it comes from. Or, it's me kind of paraphrasing it. But if it's something that's true and it can be proven to be true, that's what you hold by.
Colloquially, people don't walk around with the name of their group on their lapel, but by looking at their kippah, by seeing the books they study, people could be placed in some sort of box. And I'm not against boxes, especially when it helps us progress. But would you call yourself a Rambamist?
No, because the problem with you get into with terms like that, if you look at the writings of the Rambam, like, for example, when he mentions why he wrote the Mishnah Torah, I think it's mentioned in the Muru Nevuchim, one of the things he specifically mentions is that, as an example, initially the Mishnah Torah was for himself. That he wrote it as a study guide for himself, but if he ever had a question, he could easily reference it. And then when he looked at it a little bit harder, he saw that it had a use for not just him, but for all of Am Yisrael if possible. So one of the things the Rambam mentions in a number of his writings is the idea of how to think, especially how to think in terms of the truth. And that's the ultimate goal anyway. So it's like saying, if the Rambam is wrong about something, there's no such thing as the Rambam wrote it, it must be true. If the Rambam's wrong about it, we still have to hold by the Rambam. No, we hold by the truth no matter which direction it comes from. So if that means that, as an example, the Rambam was wrong about something, so be it. The truth is the ultimate goal, to follow Hashem in all areas and avenues. That's the ultimate goal. And even the Rambam mentions that as the goal. So if the Rambam says the goal is truth, absolute truth and ultimate truth in terms of what Hashem gives and the reality of Hashem, you can't, if someone were to say I'm a Rambamist, well, then you have to follow what he said right there. If it's the truth.
Everyone's going to claim to try to go to what they think is true. But in terms of aligning yourself with the group, for example,
let me just mention something you just stated. You just stated something very important. People are going to say what they think is true. The idea that I was always taught in terms of the people who taught me Torah, and also in my family. The thing is, you always investigate. What the truth is. You can always think whatever you want. As an example, I joke around with some family members of mine here, but I don't think it's like I don't think pineapples make a pizza. So you can't put pineapples on pizza as far as I'm concerned. But what difference does it make? I don't control pizza. I don't control pineapple. So I don't get to tell anybody what they get to put on their pizza. That's just my personal
I
thought.
agree with your ideology, and I know what you believe, but the average person is not going to know. You say that you're just a searcher of truth, or you're looking for truth,
well,
a halachic purist, right? For example, like what would you say Rabbi David Bar Chaim considers himself?
I don't know, because the thing is, the problem with trying to comment on someone I don't know personally is I don't know. Because as an example, I don't really listen to a lot of his videos. Not because of anything I agree with or disagree with. It's not in my realm of a sphere of influence, if you will. For example, I don't even know where he lives. I don't know where. I think he maybe he's from Australia, but it's like saying that's the least I know about. But
all right, so then I used the wrong person. I thought that you aligned yourself more with him.
No.
Like, for example, like Rabbi Michael Baron considers himself a Rambamist, no?
No, because I see the thing is I knew him from when I trained in Abir, because he trained in Abir one time too. So that's where we know each other. As far as I'm concerned, when you live in Israel long enough, a lot of these lines that you're mentioning as an example become almost as if like blurred, depending on what your like mindset is. So it's like saying I can hang out with Haredim just as much as I can hang out with Taimanim, and I can hang out with Moroccans just as much as I can hang out with whoever. The main thing is that the people who I'm usually around the closest are people who, as an example, would never say that, look, I'm the controller of what the truth is, or I'm the one who possesses all the truth, or this one avenue possesses all the truth. It's like saying, look, the Torah we know is the truth, and we know everybody agrees on that. The Rambam mentions this in terms of what is Kabbalah, for example. He mentions that areas where there's no like disagreement, for example, that's like true Kabbalah, because if it comes from Har Sinai and nobody disagrees on it, that's like the truth. I'll give you a quick example. If you take any Torah Moshe community, and I include any community who can be proven to be holding by the Torah correctly in terms of what has been passed down through the Masorah, in that framework. So it isn't just me saying this is my group. It's like saying there's people who could fall into groups who never use that word, and as far as I'm concerned, I would say that's Torah Moshe. But as an example, if you take the Torah Moshe community, if you will, communities worldwide, you take the Samaritans, you take the Karaites, these are the only three groups who like claim. Now I mentioned claim for a very specific reason. Claim to have ancestry from the Matan Torah at Har Sinai. There's no other group out there who says, like as an example, there's no Chiloni group who says we're Chilonim, meaning we're secular Jews who came from Har Sinai and Mount Sinai, and this is what really happened. All that stuff that the Karaites, the Samaritans, and the Torah Moshe guys say, that didn't happen. This happened instead. You don't have that. You only have three groups, and all three groups agree upon the basics of what happened there. So it's like the Esratati Brut, the 10 things that Hashem said. Everybody agrees on that. Everybody agrees on like pretty much like what was going on at Har Sinai. Where some of the disagreements come in, as an example with the Shomronim, the Samaritans, is that they have their own Torah where they have about 6,000 differences between their Torah and our Torah. And the main differences come up with like where they've added, for example, a 10th command, which they say was originally there, about Har Gerizim, the place where they say the temple was supposed to be built. The Karaites, on the other hand, for example, say a lot of different things depending on which Karaites you're talking to. If you talk to the ones who come from the oldest Egyptian communities, they would simply say something which can be a little confusing at times, to the degree of, yes, I agree with Matan Torah, I agree with the Torah as it's written, so same with Torah Moshe guys have. I just don't agree with what they claim to be the Torah Sheba'al Peh. They kind of, agree on this like system, that some of them will kind of say it's ancient, but they won't say how ancient it is. Right. So Yerush and Hakish. They'll say it's
let me
like
rephrase this.
A concept. Yeah.
I'm big on packaging what I believe and trying to hand it to other people. For example, if someone was interested in learning from your sources, in exploring your form of Judaism, where would you direct them to?
Well, the first thing I would direct them to is the actual Hebrew text itself. Now, it's like me saying you could go to a lot of different people and, for example, say, okay, well, let me just tell me what you believe. But it's like saying belief is, what you want it to be. The thing that the Rambam and Rav Said Gaon mentioned, for example, a number of times in their writings, is to know what the truth is, to know who Hashem is. So the first thing I would start with is saying, okay, I've got time to sit down with you and to go with you on the sources. Let's go to the most ancient and authoritative and authentic sources, which is the Hebrew text itself. Because I've got time to sit down with you and go through it, let's start first understanding what created everything. And that's one of the first things the Torah starts with, like Hashem created everything. And then we can go from there and start saying what are the basics and baselines that Hashem established in the Torah. And then after we go through that, if we have questions about how do we understand the Torah correctly, that's when we have to go through this process of going through, the most ancient sources and saying, okay, well, this is authoritative. This is someone's opinion. This is, maybe my opinion about it. This is where the different people I've learned from have said A, B, C, and D. And if you've got more questions, we can unpack each thing individually. Now personally, I've dealt with people, in different parts of the world I've been in, and I've had any real problem with that concept. I mean, the thing is that I would say is where I've gotten into problems where if I've tried to discuss it with them in a religious context. And what I mean by that is, to me, the word religion is more of a westernized term. As far as I'm concerned, there's just the truth. Now, again, how does one determine the truth? Well, let's look at Matan Torah at Har Sinai. Well, according to the Masorah of Am Yisrael, all of Am Yisrael who existed at the time when the Torah was given were there. So if we're talking about, okay, well, numbers, if we compare those numbers to other, if you will, religious systems that existed in ancient times, we have a numbers problem, because usually you have, in most cases, one guy, one person, or a small group of people who come out of some desert somewhere and say, well, hey, this is what I experienced. And in many cases, they didn't even write the text that say this is what they experienced. You can take that amongst a lot of different religions. And one of the experiments I did recently, about a year ago, I had a guy who asked me from America, well, how do you know this is all true? Like, the same thing we're talking about now. And I said, well, one of the things I go by as an example, the Rambam mentioned something very interesting, and I think it's Hilchot Avodah Zarah, where he mentions, for example, that at one point all of the world knew who Hashem was, but then over time, during the time of Enosh, people started doing all kinds of things and adding things to it. So he said, well, how do you know that's true? How do you know what the Rambam said is true? And I was like, wait a minute, that's a really good question. I never thought of that. So the first thing I did was I went to all the ancient religions I could find to see what their ancient and most source, if you will, driven perspective was initially. And what I found was in pretty much every part of the world that I could find, the most ancient religions all believed at one point there was one source of creation, one thing that created everything. And then over time they started adding other things to it. It was like when I looked at the Chinese culture, I found the same thing. When I looked at the Indian, with the Vedics, I found the same thing. When I looked at certain parts of Mitzrayim, Mesopotamia, and that's
all right, hold on.
I use for going through it.
Let's slow down a little bit. Well, the reason I'm asking these questions is because I think that you and I pretty much agree on 99.9% of everything. So what I do, I like to package what I believe and offer it to other people because I'm trying to help people get to where I am.
Okay.
What I usually do is direct people to certain rabbis I respect online, even though those rabbis themselves would disagree amongst themselves, right? For example, you said your teacher, Michael Baron. Also, Rabbi Bar Chaim.
Wait! I never said that was my teacher. He's not my.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right.
Yeah, I trained with him when we trained in a beer together. He's not, because he's someone I know and it's a friend of mine, but it's not. It wasn't that kind of relationship. Okay.
So David Bar Chaim is another one. Blumasur.org is another one. Jose Foer is another one.
Okay.
Even though these rabbis amongst themselves disagree, if someone's looking for a proper path, this is where I would redirect them to instead of Chabad.org or Breslov.com or whatever. For myself, I never liked the term Rambamist. I'm for sure not a Rambamist, but I do appreciate Rabbi David Chaim's approach that it's about authentic halakha or the most authentic or practical at the moment halakha. It's hard to be keeping a box.
Here's where I would have a problem with the box that you're mentioning. Okay, you named I think 2 or 3 rabbis, right?
Right. Well, 4.
Okay. So what happens when they're not here? What happens? I mean, at some point we all pass away, right?
I'm talking about their works and their writing.
If any of those,
so not to just follow them.
I agree with you, but what I'm saying is that none of us have a guarantee that any of our writings, any of our the videos you may do on YouTube, any of this stuff will survive the next 2 generations. So nobody can guarantee any of that stuff. But the one thing that has been guaranteed over the several thousand years is the Torah itself. One of the challenges that some people face, and I think the Rambam mentions this in the Mura Nevuchim, is that there are some people who have a challenge in terms of searching out the truth. And sometimes one of those challenges is the situation that they're born into, the situation that they have existed in, for a number of years. So it's like saying I've met people, as an example, who up front, they're not going to learn Hebrew. That's just their reality. And that's fine. It's not that you have to learn Hebrew to know this stuff. But there's a certain respect a person has to have for the language to know that this is not written in English. It's not a Western culture. So there's certain areas where I may have to lean on someone who understands those things and can express it to me. So that's where I prefer if I deal with somebody. It isn't for me one of those things where I can do it online in some cases. In some cases I can, but there's been times where I've said, okay, look, so there's certain areas where I may have to lean on someone who understands those things and can express it to me. So that's where I prefer if I deal with somebody. it isn't for me like one of those things where I can do it online in some cases. In some cases I can, but there's been times where I've said, okay, look, if we can meet somewhere, let's possibly just meet and sit down with it, and I can bring all the information I have. I'll give you a quick example. I did a presentation at the Spanish-Portuguese Synagogue before I made Aliyah. It was around 2006, 2007. And it was basically about the issue of of Jewish migrations into West Africa. Now, initially, I was only inviting different people from different synagogues. I was sending messages out to different synagogues. But at a certain point, I was like, well, wait a minute, that's probably not enough. So I started sending messages to like people who were Hebrew Israelites, and I didn't know what was going to happen with that. I was kind of like, apprehensive because I've had, in some cases, some dealings with Hebrew Israelites that weren't the best, but that's, just the situation. So what ended up happening was a number of them came. And it ended up being a situation where they ended up talking to people at the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, and there was a communication that opened up that hadn't been there before. And one group of, I guess you could probably call them more like black Israelites in Queens, they invited me to their Bet Knesset, and there were a couple guys there I spoke to, and one of them, initially had this real like angst against Ashkenazi Jews. And his thing was, look, I'm not recognized as a Jew. I work with a guy who doesn't keep Torah. He's recognized as a Jew. I don't like that. That doesn't make any sense to me. And I said, okay, well, let's talk about that. Let's unpack that for a second. Let me ask you a question. What Torah did your father keep? And he was like, I was like, okay, okay, fine. Let's not talk about your father, your grandfather. What Torah did he keep? Because what he was trying to get at was that he was a lost Jew that should be recognized as a Jew, just off the bat. And I was like, no problem. I don't have a problem with that. So I said, let me ask you, what was the last person in your family who kept Torah? And he was like, I was like, well, look, if you're in this situation, I hate to say it this way, you're in this situation either because Hashem caused you to be in it or he allowed you to be in it. One of the two. Now, I can't answer for that. That's between you and Hashem. But maybe what you can do is take the steps to correct that situation so that none of the future generations that come for you have to worry about that. And he thought about that for a second. Now, what ended up happening was when I left Manhattan, when I had my going away party at the Taimani Bet Knesset, the Yemenite Bet Knesset in Manhattan, he and some other guys from that synagogue showed up. And the thing that was interesting about it is it blew his mind because he was under the impression that they were doing everything so correctly at the place where he was. Because one thing he told me at one point was like, yeah, we do the correct Yemenite and Ethiopian Hebrew. And I was like, wait a minute, what you're saying is not even Yemenite Hebrew, and Ethiopians didn't have Hebrew in Ethiopia. He was like, really? I was like, yeah, who taught you that? It was just somebody offhand taught him this stuff. But when he was in a Bet Knesset, a synagogue where everybody spoke Hebrew, anyone who went to the Torah read it for themselves. It's the Yemenite tradition that anyone who goes to the Torah for the Aliyah during Shabbat or Chagim or any time, reads it for themselves. So to see everybody there knowing exactly what they're doing blew his mind. And he wasn't the same person after that. And any chance I got to try to help him out, here and there, I was able to. So and that's not the first time I've seen that happen. So. If I can say another story, there was a guy who came to Israel.
Wait, hold on. First you made the statement, so what are these people going to do when these rabbis die? But what are they going to do when you die? I believe in groups, and I believe in institutions. I think that it's easier to remain Jewish or part of a community by aligning yourself with some or even a handful of ideologies. But in terms of having to deal with someone one-on-one in order to get the message across, it's really a drop in the bucket. I'm big on people going on the internet, and I'm big on labels. Being a searcher of truth, that's such a big category. I don't like labels, but I like referring people to certain rabbis. And you mentioned Mark Angel. I'm a big fan of his website. I for sure don't agree with him probably in 10% of what he does. But
okay, but here's the beauty of life. You don't have to agree with him. That's
right, for sure. Well, but you at least have to agree in the vast majority of instances.
Not really, because think of it this way. Think of it this way. I live in Israel, for example, and if I remember correctly, you lived in Israel for 4 years, right?
Right, 5 years, yeah.
Right. So you're not here right now. The thing is, does anybody here know who you are? Some people do. The people who are into the Western media, for example, might know of you. But at the same time, there's an area of people who would look at something you're doing and say, okay, I just don't understand what he's talking about, because he's not speaking Hebrew, he's not speaking my language, blah, blah, blah. And who's to say that you're right about every little thing that you teach? You could have mistakes just like I can have mistakes, So in terms of us having to agree about every little thing, well, look, I don't agree with a number of people who are family members of mine, but that doesn't mean that we can't relate to each other in a way. And again, if your goal is the truth, and if my goal is the truth, we can relate on that. Because at the end of the day, if you and me can sit down as an example, look, the Torah is true, the Matan Torah happened, and if you don't argue with that and I don't argue with that, well, that's the starting point. And as far as I'm concerned, Matan Torah at Har Sinai is the starting point. Every time I've dealt with Karaite, it's always that starting point. And after we get from that point on, we usually don't have problems. We may not agree on everything, but we don't have problems after that point. I went to a Samaritan's house once and sat with them. We agreed on Matan Torah. Now, after we got past that point, there's some other things we didn't agree on because they have something else that's going on that's been going on for a couple, probably I would say like 1,000 years or 2,000 years, depending on what version of history you accept. that puts them in a different path where we were at least able to dialogue, and I was at least able to drink some tea from his house. I walked away saying, okay, I don't agree with that, but that's fine. That's perfectly fine. I'm not going to change his, view and way of doing things because his stuff predates my life. Now in terms of what happens after me, you're right. That's one of the reasons that you have kids. You pass on the Masorah to the kids. You leave as much of a legacy as possible. And I wrote like a whole book at one point about my family history and about my history, just to make sure my kids had something afterwards that I only got from oral traditions and oral stuff that I gathered before I made Aliyah. So that's the way, you maintain that. In terms of Torah,
you wouldn't try to change what they believe?
Who, the Samaritans?
Right. Just because they're...
How much dealing with the Samaritans have you ever had?
No, not with actual Samaritans. Spoken to Samaritans.
What I can tell you from a personal perspective, the issue you have with trying to change something like that is, first of all, like I just said before, you're dealing with something that goes back at least about, I would say, 1,500 years. So you have to respect that and you have to learn it for yourself, because the minute that you don't know anything about them or know how they interpret things, as an example, quick example, a lot of people think the Samaritans, for example, don't have an oral Torah, but they do. They 100% have their own version of an oral Torah, but the thing is, people don't think that they do, and some people walk in not misunderstanding them. I actually remember a situation where I think it was like maybe 2002 maybe, the Samaritans used to have like a website, and there were a number of like Christians who would get on there and they would praise the Samaritans because they felt it helped their position against us Jews. But there was a couple of Orthodox Jews who would get on it and argue with them like, hey, you can't interpret Torah without a Torah Shabbat. You have to have something that tells you how to like interpret it. So all these Christians were arguing, and the Samaritan guy who maintained it was only on there every once in a while. So what was happening was all these Christians saying, no, the Samaritans keep the pure Torah without Torah Shabbat, unlike you Jews. So eventually this guy was like, I want to hear from the Samaritans, not you guys, because you're not Samaritans. So eventually the Samaritan comes in and says, look, I never said we don't have a Torah Shabbat. We do have a Torah Shabbat. And I can tell you, next time I looked at the site, all the Christians had disappeared from the site. Every single one of them left because of the fact that the Samaritan said he had a Torah Shabbat. Now, this is me being able to say I can relate to them because I've been around them. Now in terms of how I can change 1,000 people, for example, out of a tradition that is old, that usually is only going to come one person at a time, because one of the challenges you have with the Samaritans, and this actually came out a few years ago, there was two sisters who left the Samaritan community, and they both converted to Judaism and married Jewish men. And what ended up happening was their family was basically like ostracized completely from community. And at one point their father was accused of like stealing stuff. And if you hear the stuff that they said about these girls about leaving their community, you would think you were talking to terrorists. The Kohen Gadol of the Samaritans, like brother, or I think his son or something, at one point was going on.
So you would try to convince them of their ideology?
Well, it's like saying, okay, it's like saying there's nothing wrong with trying. Now how far are you going to
No, right. You're for it.
I don't know.
There are many other ideologies that predate ours. Would you attempt to convince someone that Zoroaster is not the path, only because something happens to predate?
I think something that you mentioned about, as an example, the box issue. If, for example, you live in a community where there are those people available, for example, at some point, anything you do in life, you're going to have to decide, my attention span is from here to here. If anything goes beyond that attention span, at the moment, I've got other responsibilities that take over, for example. So when we get into like Samaritans, okay, you could try to convince Samaritans, but you're going to have to deal with that other cultural thing I just mentioned. That someone may say, he convinced my son or my daughter out of there, I want to take them out. Now that means that you as a person are responsible for bringing them into your community and making sure that they're protected from that situation that could come upon them. Now, again, I'm not saying don't do it. I'm not saying it shouldn't be done. I'm just simply saying that each of us individually and as a group has to decide where our obligations are going to be. So for example, you live in Florida. So there's a certain obligation you have to Florida that you don't have to Afula here in Israel because you don't live here. Now you could say, well, I could easily outreach to Afula, but unless you haven't done it yet, you don't know. So that's the thing that you get into sometimes. So that's where at some point, there was a point where I was doing videos, for example. And, just because of time, I stopped doing it. But every once in a while, I get messages from people saying, thank you for that video you did on A, B, C, and D. And every once in a while, if I have the time, I decide, okay, I'm going to do something here. But generally speaking, I've had better success when dealing with individuals and trying to impart upon them, the whole concept that the Rambam and also Rabbi Said Gon, like, for example, mentions about the truth. And, it's not just found amongst them. It's found amongst a lot of different Rishonim about the issue of the truth is the ultimate goal, and the Torah has it, and the process of Masorah has it. But, again, it's something that a person has to investigate, has to be willing to dive into it. And in some cases, there are people who can help you with it. And in some cases, it takes independent study and independent truth-seeking, if you will, to be able to get to that point. And that's the other thing, too. It's just like when you have children. I think you have children, right?
Yes.
So at some point, your children are going to leave your house, and you're responsible for them to some degree, but at some point, they make their own decisions. The only thing you can hope for is that you train them well enough to be able to make those decisions whether you're here or not. And that's the way I look at the same situation there, where what happens if the internet goes down tomorrow and that none of us can access it? Well, the only thing that survives is anything that was written at that point or anything that exists in some medium that's not electronic. I work, for example, in the high-tech field dealing with electromagnetic compatibility and interference. And one of the fears people had a couple of years ago was that the sun was going to cause a big, burst of energy that was going to take out the whole grid everywhere in the world. If that happens, we're back to the Stone Age. All the information that exists is written information. So that's where I say that, a person has to be willing to say there has to be some way that I'm going to preserve this so when I'm not here.
Right. Books are considered a form of media. Still a form
they can
of
be destroyed.
Online, I've debated two Samaritan sympathizers. I don't believe the Samaritans actually perform conversions, or I think now they've altered their tradition because they don't have enough women or whatever.
Yeah, what they did was, what happened, the story with them is that about a couple hundred years ago, they had this halakha amongst themselves where they would only marry like Samaritans. They wouldn't marry like Jews, or even like they wouldn't bring in Gerim. So when the Ottomans came into the region, like here in this region in Israel, they killed a lot of Samaritans because there was a question whether or not they could be considered under the protected people law in the Quran. So one of the things that happened was the Rishon LeZion here, the Sephardic one, the chief rabbi of Israel back in, I think, like the 1800s, I think it was, wrote a letter saying, look, they're Yisrael, the Am Yisrael, they're just a little bit in error, but they can be protected just like us. But the pogrom basically that the Turks did at one point when they were here took out enough Samaritans where in 1920 there was only 200 Samaritans. So they had to change their halakha because they were about to be extinct, at some point. So they allowed like Russian Jewish women to marry into the community initially. And I heard recently that they allow I think Arab women from like Turkey and different places who want to convert. But they don't allow men into their community. And that's what's always interesting about the people who decide they want to kind of be interested in the Samaritans who are men, where it's like, well, wait a minute, what are you going to do with that? You can't even join their community. You're just going to be some guy out by himself with nothing to offer because you can't even join their community. And that's the moment. They've gotten from so like about 1,000 nowadays. And that's half of them in Cholon, half of them in Shechem, like Har Gerizim.
But it's a similar case with the Karaites. I mean, the original Karaites, I don't think accepted converts, but this new neo-Karaite movement we see in America does accept converts. All it has to do is become Americanized in order for it to become popular.
Like, for example, we have some family members here they're from Egypt originally. And in Egypt, they had family members who were like Karaites. And one of the things about it was that the community at that point wasn't in a position to try to offer anything to anybody, because they were basically essentially in survival mode. So I met actually a woman here who was born a Karaite. She's like from a Karaite family that comes from Egypt originally. And we used to work together. And I didn't know until the day I was like leaving to work somewhere else that she was a Karaite. So we had this like long conversation one night before I left about like the whole Karaite situation. And what's interesting is she ended up marrying a guy who she called, of course, the term they use, the rabbinate. Someone who essentially was not Karaite, but who was like, supposedly from I guess you can say Torah Shabbat Pei family, meaning, a regular Jewish family. And she said the only reason she had to do that is because there weren't enough Karaite men for her to marry in her community, I believe it was. But it was funny because when we started talking, she started saying, well, you Jews, you don't know what you're doing because during Pesach, you Passover, you guys say all this stuff, the rabbi said this, the rabbi said that, but you don't even understand what's happening. And I was like, no, that's not true. The Rambam says that if you talk about Yetziat Mitzrayim, you've done like what you need to do. You don't have to say all that little stuff. So she looked at me kind of funny, like, what are you talking about? So I was like, well, you guys have like kind of like a Torah Shabbat Pei. It's Sevel HaYerusha or Akish. That's like a Torah Shabbat Pei. I know you don't like calling it that, but that's kind of what it is. And she looked at me like, what are you talking about? And it was just kind of interesting to me. I was like, well, wait a minute, how does she not know what that is? And it's an interesting dynamic. I found them interesting for a little while. But it's one of those things where I asked a couple of questions to them, and there were some areas where I felt like the people who I was talking to, even though they were from Karaite families, I wasn't getting the answers that really helped me understand them better. So I just kind of said, let me just leave that to the side, because it's like a long story, and I don't think we haven't even have time to get into it, unpack it. But like I said, I kind of at one point, like the idea of just understanding where people came from, so that I can know how to deal with people in those situations, and also understand how to approach them in terms of like the whole concepts that I carry with me every day, for example.
I'm a kindred spirit in that area, but I also try to tell people what's good for me is good for them, especially in areas of religion. And I think that if I don't do it, someone else is going to. Like I said, I think you and I agree in the vast majority of areas. But where would you say that you and I disagree?
Well, that's kind of hard for me to say. What would you say?
I'm not really sure completely what you believe. I think that it would be in the area of encouraging people to become Jewish.
Okay. Why would you say that?
Because we had a discussion on the phone probably a few years ago, and that's what you told me.
Actually, we didn't have a discussion on the phone. This is the first time I've ever talked to you on the phone, actually. I think what you're probably referencing is there were some discussions on your Facebook page where people were, in my opinion, and in some cases I was pulling that
I'm pretty
out.
sure we spoke on the phone about probably 7 years ago. And, well, okay, go ahead.
I don't think so, because I was living in Mali Demim about that time. I don't think we talked on the phone. But that's okay. But either way, I think what happened was I noticed at one point there were some people in different forums, and it wasn't just on your Facebook page. I think there were some other people on other forums that discussions came up about conversions and things like that. And I noticed in a couple areas where people were misquoting things that the Rambam wrote or different sources. And that's where I was at one point trying to correct the things they were writing by actually quoting the source itself. And I think that's where maybe some of those discussions came from. Again, my thing is, I go by source material, as much as possible, and that doesn't mean I make a mistake. I don't make mistakes in areas like that, but I think that's, if anything, if I disagree with somebody on an issue like that, the first path I usually take is to actually go to the source material itself and actually quote it. For example, if we're talking about conversions as an example, my big thing nowadays is I think that it would probably be more helpful to most people if the situation as it is right now, without there being a malchut in Eretz Israel, to have situations where the communities decide how they're going to play that out. Before there was a state of Israel, if you were in Morocco and somebody decided to they wanted to become, part of the Jewish community, that meant something different than it does like in America in 2018. Joining it in Morocco would mean that, okay, I'm leaving behind everything I know, including my family, because if they find out what I'm doing, they're going to take me out. So I'm joining the Jewish community to be a part of it. And generally speaking, within one generation, that person's already married into that community. That doesn't mean that if, somewhere in Bavel, they got a letter saying, hey, somebody converted in Morocco. They never even know. But nowadays, because of the political situation, because people, for example, may say, well, I want to move to Israel. I've had that happen where I've had somebody send me a mail saying, I want to convert because I want to move to Israel. I'm like, whoa, wait. If you've never been there before, you don't know anything about the country. It might not be the place you want to move to.
So we do disagree on this issue.
You don't want to do that. You tell me.
I'm pretty sure that you're more familiar with what I believe than I am with what you believe.
Well, I would say, okay, well, let's take it for example. What would you say as an example, based on what I just said, what would you say that you disagree with? Would you have a problem as an example with if, for example, everything just switched to local communities doing what they need to do for that area?
I'm not for people converting just because they want to move to the land of Israel. In other words, and yes, there's a lot of people who just want to convert because of that. Some people just convert because they found out they have a drop of Jewish blood in their history. I think people should convert. But, for sure, every case is an individual case.
Well, for example, if we look at the Rambam as an example, and again, this is not to say that everybody must accept the Rambam as the thing, But as an example, when the Rambam gets into the whole issue of how the process is actually done, in Hilkot Asir Rabia, he says Katzad Mikablim Gerer Tzedek, Sheyavod Litgayer, Yibdoku Acharav, Velo Yimtu Ilah. So basically saying, how do you actually do the process of converting someone? To receive somebody for be a Gerer Tzedek. Says they come, they want to convert, you check after them, and make sure that there's no issue there. Now, again, that to me seems pretty open for each community of how they decide to do that. It's saying, okay, he doesn't explain what the check is. He doesn't explain how long it is. He doesn't explain any of that stuff. So there's no set rule that it has to be a year. It doesn't have to be a day. It can be 2 hours. Depends on what they feel is the right thing.
Sure.
If they find out within 2 hours that this guy has another problem somewhere that he's trying to get away from, that's their decision to make. Now, that's the way I look at that. Now he continues. It says, about what they tell him, and basically it says, Mrimlo, Ma Ri'ita Shebaim Brahit Kayer Im Ata Yodea She Yisrael B'Zeman Azeh Tavim V'Dochachim. And he goes on and says, Israel right now has a lot of problems. We're, being chased around the world, we're being persecuted, we're being this and this and happens. So if the person says, Omer Ani Yodea Wa'ani Kadai Mikablim Oto Miyad. Okay, so you take him in, he's getting primed for the process, if you will, whatever that means, And then he continues and says, "Me'odir oto ikorei odot, shehu yeichud Hashem v'yisur avodah zarah u'merechin b'davar hazeh." Sorry. So basically, you explain to them about the Ikarim of the statutes, if you will, the Torah of Moshe, the Torah, and about the Yichud Hashem, and about the Isur of Avodah Zarah. So those two things you explain to them, and he says, Umerechin b'davar zeh. So you extend that thing, but again, how long that is? Again, if it's a community thing, they decide for themselves until the person understands, One example I can have of that right now is that I've met...
I mean, just to answer your last point in terms of how long do we extend it, it clearly says, like a few paragraphs later, that we inform him a second time when he's standing in the water. So then it can't be any longer than a day or week.
Rambam doesn't say that. He doesn't say it's a day or a week. He simply says, "Merachim b'davar zeh," about the first point. And then he says, like, if they basically accept that, then you keep going. And like I said, that depends on the person. As an example, let's say you have someone who grew up doing all kinds of avodah zarah, and that when you start talking about them at the Yichud Hashem, they start arguing with you about it. That doesn't make any sense, Asher. There's no such thing. There's got to be 12 different Elohim here. And let's say you keep arguing with them no matter what. Whatever tactics you usually use in the area. Let's say that every day you come back and it's the same thing every single day. Look, Asher, there's about 20 different Elohim out there. I don't care what you said. That's wrong. No, take that Torah, throw it out there. I want to convert. Take this Torah, throw it out the window. I don't like that. I mean, again,
I know you're trying to talk about a specific example, right? But I don't think the vast majority of people who are coming to convert are going to argue with you in terms of that idolatry is okay, according. No.
If anything is going to happen. If you find someone who you can get all this in one day, fine, do that. If it's a community thing, you can do that. That's your community. That's up to you. But what I'm saying is that the Rambam says here, "Emerachim b'davar zeh." So whatever that means to you is whatever that means to you. There is no set rule here that the Rambam says that the day doesn't say a week, it doesn't say anything. That's up to you. If you have someone who, I'll give you a quick example. I met a rabbi who explained to me at one point that there was a situation where he got a phone call from a family who was worried about their daughter who was going to marry this guy who wasn't Jewish because she met him in medical school. So they wanted this rabbi to be able to go in and basically convince the guy to go away. So he's like, I can't do that. So he's like, well, we'll try to convince him to, go to a gior. So the guy came in, and he said, the first thing the guy told me was like, I don't care about any of this like Torah stuff. I don't care about any of that, but I'll be willing to do the conversion just for the sake of the marriage to keep her family off my back. And he was like, wait, you can't do it for that reason. So he said, I talked to the guy, and I just got in my heart, like, okay, I don't know if I should do this, but not even for my community. But he said, the more I thought about it, the more I did tefillah, all that kind of stuff. He said that I came to the conclusion I needed to do it, for the reasons to make sure that the children were raised, in the Jewish community. So he said, I started working with the guy. And he said, I threw all kind of stuff at the guy, in terms of like to help him learn. And he said, everything the guy got, he learned it within like, a second or two. Hebrew. The guy taught himself Hebrew within a short period of time. Aramaic. He taught himself this. He taught himself that. And he was like, I was amazed at this guy. But then all of a sudden the guy tells me, like, well, I don't believe any of this stuff. I'm just like basically doing this so his parents will get off my back. And he says, wait a minute, you can't do that, but he said, I kept thinking about the children. So he said eventually he got through the process, same thing, didn't care. He's like, I don't believe any of this stuff. They got married, the whole family, both the husband and wife, halakhically Jewish, they got married. And he said that, a number of years passed. I didn't know what had happened, anything. He said 13 years passed, I get a phone call from the family inviting me to a bar mitzvah for this first son of this family, this couple. So he said when I got there, I saw this guy, I didn't recognize him. Because he said he had all like the trappings, all the dressing of somebody who was dati, someone who was keeping Torah. So he said all of a sudden the guy was like called, stood up to talk about his son and how proud he was of his son, keeping Torah and learning Torah and, continuing Torah. And he said, I didn't even know who I was listening to anymore. And he said, this guy who, a number of years earlier, who could care less, even to the end, all of a sudden became this guy who was transformed in the process. And he said, in my opinion, sometimes you just have to do with, what did he say? He said, sometimes you have to trust in the best of people and let Hashem do the rest. And these are the kind of stories that you come across sometimes. You can come across them in any direction. And that's why I say it depends on the situation. I mean, you may have a situation one day that is nothing like you've ever had before. You may have a situation that's like easier. That depends on the person. And that's why I say I try to look at all of these things, even when we talk about the rabbis and things like that, as individuals, not as like groups of people, because there's no group of people out here in some cases. In some cases, you have rabbis who cross all these different lines and are able to unite people across the lines, and they're not like any person you've ever met before. In some cases, you have people who push people away.
But where's the discriminant?
That's not. Well, that's what I'm saying. I don't know where the discriminant is. We went through the source material. I think we agree.
I'm very familiar with the Serbia chapter 14 and 13.
But this is the process I start to use.
That's the criteria I use if I was going to convert someone. I don't really perform conversions anymore. But I'm more into convincing people.
Any reason why not?
There's a lot of politics involved with it. I never did conversions for people who live in Jewish communities because I don't think it benefits them. I think it benefits them to go through what's considered recognized today they didn't, that they could later on enter whatever yeshiva they want, marry who they want, and so on. But if someone wants to, let's say, start a Jewish community in Ecuador, then they have 20 guys. Like, for example, we did a mass conversion in Ecuador of a former Messianic community that, they stopped believing in JC, and they wanted to go Orthodox. So we took them to Sefer Torah, then we converted them, and they started their own community. In South America, conversions aren't really allowed by the rabbinut. In other words, there's really nothing they can do. So in this area, I think that I can help. But that's why I don't do conversions in America anymore.
Well, I can tell you a story similar to that. I used to work with a group of people in Nigeria who were part of an ethnic group called the Igbos. And I started working with them maybe in 2005, I believe it was. And at the time, there was maybe like one place, the same kind of story. They used to be Messianics, and then at some point they came into contact with somebody who's from Israel who showed them like a more proper way, and they started like, their own community. So there was a guy I used to work with who was like researching, different things about Igbo culture. And initially when he started out, he was by himself, and I sent him like a bunch of books, any little materials I could get my hands on to try to get him like, knowledgeable in Hebrew, get him knowledgeable about like source material, things like that. Anything I could find that could like give him like a leg up. I sent it to him, and that included like at one point I got like about, I think it was almost like several hundred like sidurim that I got from different like synagogues around New York, and around Manhattan, and sent it to him, with the one with this other organization. And one of the things that happened was at one point they went from 7 guys in an apartment building to like 30 guys, and they built their own like Bet Knesset, and they like started, a number of communities, and their community influenced other communities, so, I mean, I think in terms of, that whole issue, I mean, look, some cases you have to, do the best you can and do what you think is right in some cases. And, at some point those people may work it out for themselves, in terms of what goes on in America, again, I'm in a different like time zone, so, I can't really like speak to that. But I'm a firm believer that if something's the right way and if it's the truth, then, it'll continue on its own. I think the basic challenge that any group has with, not being a part of a Jewish community initially is the issue of, being on level playing ground with someone who is, as an example. If you have someone who decides they want to convert somewhere, and basically they convert and then they go back to their own little place, which is far away from any Jewish community, whether it be you or anyone, that can be a challenge. I'm not saying it's something they can't overcome. I'm just saying it's a challenge. What happens, when everyone else is like, making leaps and like jumps in Hebrew and they're like not speaking Hebrew at all, the question is, what do they do with their children? And I think that's where some of the issues come up in some cases, and I think in other cases, the whole state of Israel thing, kind of complicates it when you have the whole idea of being able to move to Israel. When there was no state of Israel, you convert in some little location and nobody ever knew you were there, and it'd be perfectly fine. One generation later, you marry somebody Jewish in the community, that whole thing, disappeared, to some degree. But now, being able to move here kind of complicates it to some degree for that matter. But I think that, at some point, people, will get that figured out. I mean, I think at some point, future generations, maybe within the next 2, could some point get to the point where it's like, okay, that's less of an issue. Let's just get everybody on the right board, on the right books, get them to where they're not out by themselves doing some little thing out there and work it out that way. And I think that if communities did their own conversions, it could go back to that. I think if it was less of a political issue, I mean, even if you were to say, look, we do conversions, but that whole moving Israel thing, don't even think about that right now. Deal with Hashem, deal with what the truth of the matter is, deal with, the Torah, the halakha, the things that are required, worry about that, and everything else will work itself out. And I truly believe that, to some degree, but it takes work, and it's not an easy thing. I've met people who, wanted to do conversions, but were not considering the concept of living in a Jewish community. I've also met people, like as an example, I met a girl who grew up as a secular Muslim in, some part of New York, I forgot which part. And what happened was she was learning about Judaism. She learned from some Hasidim who she got interested by, like Jewish music, I think it was. And what had happened was her father found her books and immediately, went off on her. I mean, even though he wasn't religious, she went off on her to the point where she had to leave. And she eventually moved into like Brooklyn. She's done pretty well for herself the last time I talked to her. So I think the challenge that some people have is that if they're in a community, community that can kind of bring them along and bring them up to speed, it makes things a little bit easier. But some people have to find that. Some people have to like shop around. It's like the saying that goes buyer beware in some cases.
How do you feel about what most Orthodox rabbis do nowadays? That they offer, let's say, like a no-id existence as an alternative to converting to Judaism, a form of no-idism, not just a no-id laws.
Well, I think that I think there's a couple ways to look at that because I've met a lot of different people have a lot of different views on that. You know, I mean, when you say Orthodox as an example, even that means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I know some people, for example, who are the whole idea of someone not Jewish wanting to be Jewish is a new thing to them, you know, to them personally, you know. I know some people whose families came from places where there was no such thing as someone who wasn't Jewish wanting to join the Jewish community. So all of a sudden, for this interest to exist, it causes some question, because it's like, wait a minute, where was this interest, like, you know, a couple of generations ago when my father was getting beat up in the streets of, like, you know, Merachesh? You know, where was this interest when, you know, we were in Sana and, you know, all the rabbis got massacred, you know, from everybody, you know? All of a sudden, where does this come from? You know, some people just, it's an interest, it's less of like that issue, but more of, wow, that's really weird that somebody would want to join Am Yisrael, you know, especially at this time. You know, so there are some people I've met who that's their issue, for example. I'm kind of less in contact with the people who are like pushing it that it must be the Sheva Mitzvot in Av Noach. I'm more in line with people who say, you know, look, this is what they want, this is what they can do, this is the baseline. You know, if they want more than that, they can have more than that, not a problem. You know, in terms of what I think about it, again, I think you have to take it on an individual basis.